So I want to talk about the 1976 presidential election because, oh, why bloody not? More specifically about the Republican National Convention, because specificity is more specific, and getting more specific about things that were perhaps shrouded in a bit of mystery always works out well and is extremely profitable. Timely humor! So in 1974, the greatest president in the history of the world, Richard Nixon, for those who know and eat Smoky Moe's, decided that the people were being too ungrateful for his years of service and kicking 12 different kinds of butt as the American president. Thus he peaced out and flew on a helicopter to his home in California, where he presumably hung out in Disneyland for the rest of his days. Side note, if you're wondering why Nixon was the most super fantastic of all time ever president, then it's my duty as a history scholar to inform you that you are a freaking idiot! Anyway, after Nixon went all love me or leave me, there was a huge leadership gap in the Republican Party, as now their standard bearer was gone. Thus in 1976, Republicans were faced with the choice of who they could possibly elect to take the place of Nixon. Gerald Ford, who had inherited the presidency after Nixon left, was like, "Hey guys, what about me?" And Republican voters were like, eh. Meantime, Ronaldo Reagan decided it was time for some fresh leadership and some fresh moves in the White House, and said, "Well, how about me then?" And Republican voters were like, eh. Primaries had become all the rage at this point, and people figured these would decide the whole thing. At first, Ford seemed to be in the lead as he won most of the early primaries based on his great appeal for... But then Reagan surged in the later half of the primary season so that neither had a majority by the time of the convention, and were basically tied, much like how the Chicago Cubs and Cleveland Indians were tied in the 8th inning of the World Series after Rajai Davis's home run. Yet like that game, there could only be one winner, and so the primary race went into extra innings at the Republican National Convention, where the delegates would have to pick who would face Mr. Peanut in the 1976 election. Reagan made a big final push to get elected, but delegates were like, "Yeah, no thank you!" and decided to give the nomination to Ford because, you know, he'd make little promises about providing presidential privileges to delegates who voted for him, and other extremely above-board tactics. So Ford gets the nomination, gets up on the podium, and gives a speech connecting the history of America to the current state of the Republican Party, and how the U.S. is now at peace, which, you know, is what happens when you lose the war in Vietnam. And then talked about how Republicans must be united to bring about all sorts of neat changes. People heard the speech and were like, "Hey, that's pretty good." Then Ford decided to show his commitment to this whole unity thing by calling down Reagan and asking him to give a little speech. Reagan complied and gave a speech. It was a typical Reagan speech in that, you know, it was masterfully delivered and made everyone in the audience super happy and proud of their party. At least at first. See, after Reagan gives this speech, the delegates were like, "Crap, we should have nominated that guy." But by then it was too late. They'd selected Ford, and he would go on to face Mr. Peanut in the presidential election, where he would do such amazing things as saying that there was no Soviet domination of Eastern Europe. A quality presidential candidate. Despite such stellar debate moments, Ford lost and Mr. Peanut won the election. So what's the lesson we can draw from all this? Well, have you ever been with someone, perhaps in a romantic relationship, and you think, well, this person's good and solid, and maybe there's no real spark or anything, but, you know, that only happens in the movies. And you decide this person's the best option for you, and you, in a sense, settle for that person because you see them as a safe choice, and it's only after you've tied yourself down to that person that someone else starts to become more visible to you. And you realize that the spark, the light you dreamed about was right in front of you the whole time. And that in your effort to play it safe, you've actually missed out on being with one of the most incredible people you've ever met. That the happiness, the love, the companionship you thought were just a dream could have been yours, but are now lost forever. And that you will now lose the 1976 presidential election to a peanut farmer. Thus, the 1976 presidential election teaches us an important lesson about love and relationships, and about never blinding ourselves to the best option, so that we can begin the Reagan Revolution 4 years early. Thank you for watching. Be sure to smash that like button if you enjoyed this video. If I get 50,000 likes, I might do another one. If you have any stories about how you picked the wrong person in your time and ended up losing the 1976 presidential election, please share them in the comments. This has been a history lesson, and remember, without history, there would be no history. Thank you, good night, and Buddha bless.